King's Guard WARNS tourist, 3 times then LETS RIP charging horse.
I wonder how long they have
The
to
sun
stay
was
mounted.
shining brightly, painting the sky a perfect blue, and the busy streets seemed a little bit quieter than usual as people gathered in front of one of the most famous landmarks in the world, the Royal Palace. The air was full of excitement, with tourists from all over the world eager to see one of the most iconic symbols of British history, the King's Guard. Standing perfectly still in front of the grand gates of the palace, a soldier dressed in a bright red uniform and wearing a tall, black bearskin hat looked like a statue. His face was completely serious, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and his posture as rigid as a board. He didn't move a muscle, not even when the occasional gust of wind tried to knock his hat askew. The King's Guard was an impressive sight, but the most impressive thing about him wasn't his uniform or even the horse by his side. It was his discipline. He stood there like a sentinel, completely focused, guarding not only the palace but centuries of tradition. Yet today, something was different. The crowds that always gathered around the palace were larger than usual, with tourists pushing in every direction to snap photos, try to get selfies, and generally test the boundaries of respect. While most of the visitors respected the unspoken rules of the palace grounds, there were always those who didn't quite understand the significance of the King's Guard. They didn't see the sacred role he played, nor did they understand that getting too close to the guard, or even disturbing the horse, could be seen as disrespectful. Among the many faces in the crowd, one stood out. A tall man in his mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap and a bright t-shirt that read, "I read London," was moving through the crowd with his camera raised high, taking pictures of everything he could. His name was Tom, an American tourist who had only arrived in London a few days ago. He had heard all the usual tourist advice. Don't walk too close to the guard, don't make sudden movements, don't disturb the horse. But like many first-time visitors, he didn't quite understand what made these rules so important. Tom wasn't a troublemaker. He was just an excited tourist, eager to see everything this city had to offer. But he had a habit of pushing the limits just a little bit. He had already visited the major landmarks, the Tower of London, Big Ben, the London Eye, and now here he was, standing in front of the palace gates, waiting for the perfect moment to snap that one picture that would show off his bravery. He saw tourists standing near the guards, posing for photos, and thought to himself, if they can do it, why can't I? With his camera in hand, Tom began making his way closer to the guard. His friends, also tourists, were behind him, laughing and encouraging him to get closer for a better shot. "Go on, man, just get right up there, they won't mind." One of his friends shouted from behind, trying to get in on the action. Tom laughed and moved forward, feeling a sense of excitement build up in his chest. He wasn't just taking a picture anymore. He was getting an up-close look at something unique, something that most tourists didn't get to experience. However, as Tom stepped forward, something happened that he didn't expect. The horse, which had been standing calmly at the guard's side, shifted its weight. Its ears twitched slightly and it snorted, a soft but clear sound. Tom paused, but the excitement of the moment kept him going. He was so focused on getting the perfect shot that he didn't notice the change in the atmosphere. The horse's reaction, though small, was a sign that it wasn't entirely comfortable with Tom's approach. The guard, still standing rigidly, didn't move. His eyes were locked ahead, his expression unchanged. But even though his face was stoic, there was something in his posture that changed. The calmness of the situation was beginning to slip away. With a low, steady voice, the guard spoke. "Step back, sir." It was a simple command, but it was clear and direct. It wasn't said in anger or frustration, just in a calm, firm tone. The guard wasn't warning Tom because he was angry. He was warning him because this was the protocol. The guard had a job to do. He wasn't there for photos or entertainment. He was standing guard, representing the authority and tradition of the British monarchy. And part of that job meant protecting the sacred space around him, as well as his horse. Tom, however, didn't fully understand the seriousness of the situation. He thought the warning was part of the act, just another part of the Royal Guard's show for the tourists. After all, the guard didn't seem to be moving. He was still standing perfectly still, and the horse wasn't doing anything to suggest that it was about to charge. So, Tom shrugged off the warning, thinking it was just part of the experience. "Come on," Tom whispered to his friends with a grin. "It's fine, I'm just gonna get a closer shot." His friends giggled and encouraged him further, telling him to go for it. But there was one thing Tom didn't realize. The King's Guard was not there to entertain tourists. He was there to uphold centuries-old traditions, and he had a duty to maintain his discipline at all costs. If Tom wasn't careful, he could make a serious mistake. Meanwhile, the guard's patience was wearing thin. He had already given one clear warning, and now, Tom was still moving closer. The guard had his eyes fixed straight ahead, but he was acutely aware of every movement around him, including the man who was pushing his luck. The horse, too, was becoming restless. It shifted its feet again, and this time the guard's grip tightened slightly on the reins. Tom didn't notice any of these signs. He was still intent on getting that perfect photo, but as he stepped even closer, he felt the air around him shift. The crowd was still buzzing, but something about the guard's stillness made it seem as though the world had quieted down. It was as though everyone, except for Tom, had recognized the warning and chosen to step back. But Tom, lost in his excitement, kept pushing forward. He could feel the eyes of the tourists watching him, but in that moment he didn't care. He was determined to take that photo, no matter what. And yet, what he didn't realize was that the King's Guard had already warned him once. And soon, the consequences of ignoring that warning would become impossible to ignore. Tom was too focused on his camera, aiming it at the guard and his horse, to notice how the atmosphere around him had started to change. The excited chatter of the crowd continued, but the energy was subtly shifting. The tourists who had been taking photos from a distance began to notice the silent tension in the air, but Tom was oblivious to all of it. He stepped even closer to the guard, thinking that he was just part of the royal display. As he got within a few feet of the guard, Tom finally paused to check the photo on his camera screen. He grinned to himself, satisfied with what he'd captured so far. "This is going to be amazing," he thought, completely unaware that his proximity to the guard and the horse was crossing a line. The horse, still standing calmly beside the guard, suddenly shifted its weight. Its head tilted slightly as it gave a soft snort, clearly alert. The animal's large, brown eyes flicked toward Tom, and its ears twitched, a sign that it wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. This was the first real sign that Tom might be in danger of pushing things too far, but Tom, so absorbed in his photo, didn't notice. The camera clicked again and again, capturing every little detail of the scene. The shiny brass buttons on the guard's uniform, the towering bearskin hat, and even the horse's glossy coat. To him, it felt like a picture-perfect moment. The guard, however, was not as absorbed in Tom's photo session. He stood like a statue, but his sharp eyes were trained on the tourist who was getting far too close for comfort. His posture stiffened ever so slightly, a small shift that signaled he was ready to take action if needed. Despite his quiet presence, the guard was deeply aware of his surroundings. His job wasn't just to look impressive. It was to protect the monarchy and uphold the dignity of the royal tradition. The lines between respectful behavior and disrespect were clear to him, and when they were crossed, it was his duty to intervene. With a firm yet controlled voice, the guard spoke again. "Step back, sir." It wasn't shouted, nor was it a mere suggestion. It was a direct order, said with a quiet but commanding tone that made it clear he wasn't joking. For the first time, Tom felt a slight jolt of discomfort, but he still didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. To him, this was just part of the pageantry, a soldier doing his job as a show for the tourists. He was probably supposed to look stern and serious. It was all part of the experience, wasn't it? Tom didn't move. His eyes were still glued to the camera screen as he zoomed in on the guard's face, trying to get a clearer shot of the soldier's serious expression. A couple of people nearby turned their heads at the sound of the guard's warning, but most were too caught up in their own conversations and photos to pay much attention. They didn't see what was coming. Tom's friends, who were still laughing and chatting, didn't notice the growing tension either. They continued to encourage him. "Go on, man, just one more, you're almost there," one of Tom's friends urged, nudging him forward with a grin. Tom smiled and took another step closer. That was when the warning began to sink in, not just for Tom, but for the people watching. The guard's voice wasn't loud, but the air around him seemed to crackle with an invisible tension. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset, but he had already given one warning, and Tom hadn't listened. The guard's calm expression remained unchanged, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the horse. The horse's muscles tensed as if it knew what was coming. It wasn't just a statue standing still now. It was a living creature, and it was beginning to get restless. The slight snorting noises it had been making before became more frequent, and the horse pawed at the ground with its front hooves, a sign that it was growing more and more uneasy. Still, Tom remained oblivious. He thought the movement was just the horse fidgeting, nothing to worry about. His friends were still egging him on. "Come on, dude, you're gonna regret it if you don't get this shot. Go on, get closer," one of his friends urged, laughing. Tom glanced at the camera screen one more time, checking the photo. He was so close now, so sure that he had the perfect picture. He didn't even notice how much closer he was to the guard, how he was now practically within arm's reach of the horse. And then the guard's patience began to fray. He wasn't going to warn Tom again. His job was to protect, not to entertain. This wasn't the time for a lesson in manners. It was time for action. The guard took a slow, deliberate step forward, just enough to signal to Tom that he was serious. The movement caught Tom's eye, and for the first time he felt a little chill. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as playful as he thought it was. But even then, Tom hesitated. It wasn't enough to make him back off. The excitement of the moment was still too strong. The crowd, mostly quiet now, was beginning to notice the tension. Some tourists took a few steps back, sensing that something wasn't right, but others remained oblivious, still snapping photos of the scene unfolding before them. "Step back," the guard repeated, this time with more force. His voice was still steady, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. The tone was different now. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Tom, though, was still thinking about the shot. "I'm almost there," he muttered under his breath. He reached his hand out, getting closer to the horse's mane, thinking he could capture an even better picture. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly as Tom's hand inched closer. The horse snorted again, louder this time, and its body shifted, its head tossing from side to side. It wasn't a good sign. Tom finally looked up from his camera, and that's when he noticed it. The guard's posture had changed. His shoulders were squared, his eyes locked on Tom with a firm, unwavering gaze. There was no more room for play. The soldier's patience had run out. For the first time, Tom realized he had pushed things too far, but it was already too late to back off. The tension in the air was so thick now, it seemed like the world around him had slowed down. The sound of the crowd and the distant traffic blurred into the background as Tom felt the weight of the moment. His friends, sensing the shift, began to laugh nervously, realizing that perhaps they had encouraged something they shouldn't have. But even then, Tom wasn't quite sure what would happen next. Would the guard just push him away, or was something else coming? Just then, the horse let out another snort, louder and more forceful than before. The sound was a clear warning. Tom quickly stepped back, realizing that the tension had reached its peak and that it was time to listen. But his hesitation had already set things in motion. The atmosphere had shifted. What had started as an innocent and harmless photo session was now thick with tension. Tom, still caught up in the thrill of the moment, hadn't yet fully grasped the seriousness of the situation. His camera was still in his hands, and his eyes were still focused on the screen, as though he was in his own world, completely unaware of the danger slowly creeping up around him. The guard, who had been standing like a statue for what seemed like an eternity, finally moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight shift of his feet, but it was enough to signal a change. The guard's eyes, which had been focused ahead, now flicked to Tom, and in that brief look the warning was crystal clear. He wasn't playing anymore. The smile on Tom's face started to fade as he sensed something was wrong. The guard's eyes, though still stoic and impassive, held a quiet power that made Tom feel small and out of place. At first, Tom thought the movement was just a small adjustment, a soldier shifting his weight. He didn't realize that it was more than that. It was the guard preparing for action, positioning himself to deal with the growing disturbance. He had already issued one warning. Tom hadn't listened. Now the guard was giving him a chance to step back again, but this time there was no mistaking the seriousness in his posture. The horse, which had been fidgeting and snorting intermittently, now shifted its position more aggressively. Its hooves scraped against the stone ground, and it pawed at the pavement as if it was readying itself for something. It wasn't just the restless movement of an animal, it was the animal's warning too. The horse's eyes narrowed, and it looked directly at Tom, its ears swiveling back in a clear sign of discomfort. The guard and the horse were a unit, moving and reacting as one, and it was obvious that something needed to change before things escalated further. The crowd, which had been excitedly snapping photos, slowly began to realize that the scene in front of them was no longer just a display. Whispers spread through the people gathered nearby as they started to understand the warning signs. Some tourists began stepping back, sensing that their own safety might be at risk if the situation wasn't handled soon. Others stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. But Tom, in his own bubble of excitement, continued to ignore the growing tension around him. "Just one more," he mumbled to himself, raising his camera again. He adjusted the lens, zooming in on the guard's face, trying to capture every detail of the solemn soldier. His friends, who had been encouraging him before, were now standing behind him, quieter than before. Their voices were hushed, as if they too had sensed that things were about to take a turn. But Tom, determined to get that perfect picture, didn't notice the change in tone. And then, with the kind of calm that comes with someone who has seen it all before, the guard spoke again. This time his voice was louder, stronger, and more authoritative than ever. "I told you to move back." The words weren't just a command, they were a final warning. Tom froze. For the first time, he truly heard the weight in the guard's words. There was no joking in that voice. It wasn't a playful move back as he had expected. It was a demand. The kind of demand that carried with it the unspoken understanding that there would be consequences if it wasn't followed. Tom's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought it would go this far. He had assumed the guard would just stand there unmoving as people came close, taking pictures and having fun. But this wasn't a show. This was real. And now the guard had spoken again, making it clear that his patience had reached its limit. Tom took a small step back, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't the step back that the guard had asked for. It was more of a hesitant shuffle, a half-hearted attempt to respect the warning. The excitement in Tom's chest was quickly being replaced by a cold knot of unease. His camera hung limply in his hands as he glanced around at the other tourists, who were all looking at him with wide eyes. He could see the concern in their faces now. They weren't smiling or laughing anymore. They were watching him, waiting for him to do the right thing. But Tom, still caught up in the idea of getting that perfect shot, didn't realize that he was standing too close to the guard and the horse. The guard's patience was running out, and Tom's half-step back wasn't going to cut it. The horse, now fully alert, took another step forward. It was as though the animal itself had reached its breaking point. The heavy hooves clacked against the stone floor, louder this time, and the animal's nostrils flared. The horse seemed to be saying, "This is enough." The guard didn't wait for Tom to fully comprehend the situation. He took one deliberate step forward, and this time it was clear that the soldier was done with warnings. His hand, still holding the reins, was steady, but his body was tensed, ready to act. Tom could feel the change in the air, like the calm before a storm. The guard's eyes locked onto him with such intensity that Tom could no longer ignore the fact that he was in the wrong. He had crossed a line. Tom took another step back, but now it felt like it was too little, too late. The horse let out a loud snort, shaking its head as if to warn him. The crowd, sensing that the situation had escalated, began to murmur nervously. Some took a few steps back, while others began to slowly edge toward the exit, not wanting to be too close when things went from tense to dangerous. But still, there was a part of Tom that didn't want to let go of the photo opportunity. He didn't want to believe that it could go any further. His friends, now seeing the seriousness of the situation, began to pull at his arm. "Tom, come on, let's go. This is getting weird," one of them said, tugging him away. But Tom, still unsure of the full consequences, resisted. He glanced once more at the horse, and for a brief moment, he saw something in its eyes that made him realize just how close he was to making a serious mistake. The guard's stance had shifted from being a passive observer to a clear protector, his focus entirely on Tom now. His shoulders were squared, and his grip on the reins tightened. Every inch of him was preparing for whatever might come next. The horse was restless, agitated, and ready to react to any movement it deemed threatening. And then Tom finally understood. It wasn't just a guard he was dealing with. It was a team, a soldier and a horse, both trained for situations like this. Tom had pushed too far, and the consequences were now about to unfold. He had reached the point of no return. Tom's heart began to race as the air around him grew heavier. The seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly. His mind was still clouded with confusion. What had started as a harmless tourist moment, a simple desire to capture the grandeur of London and its traditions, was quickly becoming something much more serious. And yet, Tom couldn't seem to fully process the gravity of the situation. The King's Guard, standing as rigid as ever, was no longer the calm, motionless figure he had been at the beginning of the day. There was a palpable shift in his presence. Every inch of his posture screamed authority, his body taut and poised for action. The stoic face, which had remained calm for so long, now carried an almost imperceptible tension. The hand gripping the reins was firm, unyielding. There was no trace of the polite, accommodating figure tourists usually saw. No, this was a soldier, and this was no longer about smiles for the camera. Tom, now fully aware of the rising tension, took another small step back. His friends, who had been watching him, began to murmur among themselves, their excitement waning. "Dude, you need to move." "This is getting crazy," one of them said, pulling at Tom's sleeve. Tom didn't respond immediately. He was still transfixed by the guard and the horse, feeling a strange mix of awe and fear. The guard hadn't shouted. He hadn't raised his voice. But everything about him screamed enough. And then it happened. The horse let out a sharp snort, its nostrils flaring with a kind of controlled frustration. The sound was louder than before, echoing through the stillness of the palace grounds. It wasn't a normal snort. It was a clear signal that the horse was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Its muscles tensed as if preparing for something. The horse's head jerked upward, and for a split second, Tom felt a wave of dread wash over him. Suddenly, with a burst of powerful energy, the horse reared up on its hind legs. its hooves striking the air with a force that made the ground tremble. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that Tom stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance. The crowd, who had been standing in quiet awe until this point, gasped in unison, some even stepping back in shock. Tom's camera hung loosely in his hands, forgotten now, as he stared wide-eyed at the horse's powerful display. The horse wasn't just rearing for no reason. It wasn't a playful gesture. This was a warning that Tom had ignored too many times. The horse was asserting its space, making it clear that it would not tolerate further disturbance. And more importantly, it was showing Tom that this was no longer a situation where he could remain ignorant of the danger. The guard, still unflinching, had not moved a muscle, his gaze fixed firmly on Tom. The way the soldier and his horse moved in perfect synchronization was astonishing. It was clear that they had both been trained for moments like this. The guard, knowing that his horse was now fully agitated, was in complete control. The horse, still rearing, looked down at Tom, its eyes wide and alert, its nostrils flaring with every breath. Tom felt his breath catch in his throat. The energy in the air had shifted entirely. What had been an innocent attempt at a picture had turned into a life lesson, a lesson in respect, in boundaries, and in the quiet authority of tradition. Tom's mind raced. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd around him, their voices hushed with awe and perhaps a little fear. They knew what was coming. They knew that this wasn't just a random event, it was a serious warning that no one should ignore. The guard's voice cut through the air again, sharp and commanding. "Last warning," he said, louder this time, his tone full of finality. There was no question in his voice, no room for hesitation. He wasn't asking Tom to move back anymore. He was telling him firmly that if Tom didn't listen this time, there would be consequences. The guard had reached the end of his patience. Tom stood frozen, his legs shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt this vulnerable in his life. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming. His friends had completely backed away now, their faces full of concern. They were no longer laughing. The situation had stopped being a joke. Tom could feel their eyes on him, and he knew they were silently urging him to do the right thing. The horse, still rearing, came down on its hooves with a heavy thud that echoed across the square. The sound sent a shiver down Tom's spine. The warning was clear. This was not a playful gesture. This was not something that could be ignored. And yet, despite the clarity of the situation, Tom still hesitated. The adrenaline in his veins made him question his instincts. Should he move back now? Was it too late? But then, just as he felt himself ready to retreat, something deep inside him told him that he had already crossed the line. The horse's wild eyes locked onto his, and for the briefest of moments, it seemed like the animal could sense his hesitation, his uncertainty. There was a moment of silence, no snorts, no sounds of hooves, just the low hum of the crowd. And in that brief stillness, the guard and his horse held Tom's gaze, and that's when it finally hit Tom. He realized that this wasn't just about getting a photo anymore. This wasn't about him or his friends or the perfect shot. This was about respect. It was about understanding the power of tradition, the history, and the seriousness of the king's guard. He had been given more than enough chances to back off. The guard had warned him multiple times. The horse had shown its discomfort. And now, Tom understood what had been so clearly laid out before him. He had ignored it all, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. With one last, shaky breath, Tom took a step back, his feet moving slowly but deliberately. The weight of the situation settled on his shoulders, and the crowd seemed to let out a collective sigh of relief as he finally began to back away. The horse lowered its head slightly, and its body relaxed a little. The guard's posture remained firm, but there was a subtle shift. He relaxed just a bit, no longer in a state of readiness. Tom, still in a state of shock, finally turned to face his friends who were standing a little further back, their faces a mix of concern and relief. They hadn't said anything, but they didn't need to. They knew the lesson that had just been learned. Tom, still feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins, finally muttered, "I think we should go." As he stepped back into the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the guard and his horse. He had learned in the most unexpected of ways that there were some traditions that demanded respect. Some moments in life couldn't be brushed off with a laugh or a photo. This was one of those moments. And Tom would never forget it. Tom's legs felt weak as he took that first step backward, away from the guard and the horse. The moment the horse had reared up, it felt as if time had slowed down for him. Now, as he moved farther back, his mind raced. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. He had pushed his luck too far. For a moment, everything around him felt distant, like he was watching a scene unfold from far away. He heard the murmur of the crowd, the faint clicking of cameras, the footsteps of people moving away from the tension. But his focus remained fixed on the soldier and his horse. The guard had not moved a muscle, still standing tall and unyielding, but the message was clear. Tom had tested the boundaries, and the consequences were now unavoidable. Tom glanced behind him to see his friends standing at a distance, watching him with expressions of disbelief. They didn't need to say anything. Their wide eyes and the way they stood slightly apart told him they had realized, just as he had, that he had come far too close to a dangerous situation. For a brief second, Tom felt a twinge of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of relief. He was moving away. He was safe, or so he thought. However, the relief didn't last long. Just as Tom was beginning to feel that he had avoided the worst of it, the atmosphere around him seemed to change again. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. There was a sudden shift in the air, like a storm that had just passed but still left a lingering tension. Tom turned his head back to the guard and the horse, unsure if he should keep walking or stop completely. And that's when he saw it. The guard, who had been standing motionless, suddenly stepped forward. It wasn't just a simple shift of weight this time. It was a deliberate, calculated move. Tom froze as the sound of the guard's polished boots hitting the ground seemed to echo in the silence that had fallen over the crowd. The guard was no longer standing as a figure of authority from a distance. He was closing the gap. The horse, who had been agitated earlier, now took another step forward. Its large, powerful body seemed to take up more space, as though it was staking its claim on the area. The way the animal moved was graceful yet imposing. Its hooves clicked loudly against the stone, adding to the rising sense of urgency in Tom's chest. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a soldier protecting his post. This was a soldier and a horse working together as one, and they weren't about to let anyone disrupt their duty any longer. "Move back," the guard said again, but this time his voice was colder, firmer. There was no mistaking the finality in his words. He wasn't asking anymore. He wasn't warning. He was commanding, and this was no longer a suggestion. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He had thought he was out of danger. But as the guard's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine, Tom realized that the threat was real. This wasn't a drill. The guard wasn't there to entertain the tourists. He was there to protect, and he would do whatever was necessary to ensure his post remained unchallenged. The horse, still beside the guard, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Its ears flicked back as it snorted again, louder this time, clearly agitated. Its nostrils flared and it took a few more steps forward. The guard moved with the horse, keeping pace with its movements, their bond evident. The horse wasn't just an animal, it was an extension of the soldier's power and authority. For a brief moment, Tom found himself paralyzed with fear. His mind was spinning, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. Why hadn't he listened the first time? Why hadn't he realized that the king's guard wasn't just a performance for the tourists? He had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. He took a step back, but it wasn't enough. It was too little, too late. The guard's posture remained rigid and controlled, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. His focus was entirely on Tom now. Every movement of the soldier and the horse was deliberate, their communication silent but unmistakable. Tom knew that he had been given every opportunity to back off and respect the boundaries. And now, the consequences were unfolding in front of him. Tom could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the whispers of people behind him, but he was too focused on the guard and the horse to think about anything else. His feet felt like lead, his heart thudding in his chest. He had pushed his luck, and now the consequences were about to become clear. Suddenly, the guard made another move. It wasn't just a shift of his feet, it was a full step forward, almost as if he were closing the gap, making sure Tom knew that this was it. The horse, in perfect sync with its rider, moved too. The air around Tom seemed to crackle with energy as the tension reached its peak. The crowd behind him seemed to hold its collective breath. No one was laughing anymore. No one was taking photos. Tom, realizing that he had no other choice, finally took another step back, this time farther than he had before. But it wasn't enough. The gap between him and the guard seemed to close even as he moved backward, like the soldier and his horse were one step ahead of him. The guard's eyes never left his. They were cold, unblinking, and unwavering. It was clear now that this wasn't just a moment of authority, it was a test of respect. Tom had failed that test, and now he was about to learn the lesson. The horse, still calm but clearly in a defensive stance, seemed to gather its strength. It was ready to charge. The powerful muscles of the horse rippled under its glossy coat. Its hooves struck the ground again, and the tension in the air reached a boiling point. Tom's eyes widened. He could feel the ground beneath him shift, the air around him charged with the force of the moment. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew it wouldn't be pretty. For a split second, Tom thought the guard might allow the horse to charge. It was as if the soldier was willing to let the horse do its job, to send a message that no one, not even tourists, should take the royal guard for granted. The horse's eyes flashed, and Tom's breath caught in his throat. He knew that if the horse charged, he wouldn't be able to escape. But then, just as quickly as the tension had built, the guard gave one final, sharp command. "Move back now." Tom didn't wait another second. His body moved on instinct, retreating as quickly as possible. He felt the heat of the moment fade as he took several steps back, finally putting some distance between himself and the guard. The horse, seeing that the threat had been diffused, snorted once more, its stance relaxing slightly. The tension that had been in the air seemed to dissipate, but only for a moment. Tom, still shaking, finally turned to look at his friends. They were standing farther away now, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. They had witnessed the entire exchange in silence. Tom, still caught in the whirlwind of emotions, realized just how close he had come to something far more serious. He didn't look back at the guard. Instead, he nodded to his friends, wordlessly signaling that it was time to leave. His excitement had vanished, replaced with a newfound respect for the guard and the history he represented. As they walked away from the palace grounds, Tom couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had come to London to experience its sights and sounds, but he had learned something much more important: respect. The King's Guard wasn't there to entertain tourists. He wasn't just a figurehead to be photographed. He was a symbol of centuries of tradition, and for the first time, Tom truly understood the weight of that responsibility. Tom might not have been injured, but he had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson he would carry with him long after the moment had passed.